called Idolatry. And it's for Peter Bullen, Quiet Life. They say that whenever someone asked Beethoven to explain the meaning of one of his sonatas, that he would sit right back down at his piano as though he hadn't even heard the question, and simply play them all out over again, without saying a word. Pablo Picasso, it is rumored, sometimes carried a gun around with loaded blanks in it for any bourgeois in the streets, he said, who dares to ask me the significance of one of my paintings. We have to remember Picasso was Spanish, so his English was terrible. Finally, I have heard it said also that from a number of witnesses, Sir Peter Bullen of Quiet Lightning sometimes likes to poke strangers in the gut with a toothpick or a hairpin, and for no good reason at all. As for myself, I am worse than all of these people. For you see, the need, the want, the compulsion to be understood rather than not so sometimes makes me a monster. And if anyone ever asks me about one of my poems, this one for instance, I'm going to look them dead in the eye and tell them everything. Each morning, first of all, I always start out with a blank page, right here in my moleskin notebook, which pretty much stays empty for 22 to 24 hours of the day, roughly speaking. I then read extensively from 6 to 7 different newspapers from all over the world, one from every continent, none of which are owned by Rupert Murdoch. The Berlin Water Schnitzel, for instance, the Charleston Shuffle, that's my favorite, the Italian Chestnut, which I'm sure you're familiar with, as with the rest, which are not necessary to name. All of 3, maybe 4 times a year only, I like to smoke the finest Turkish hashish from my corncob pipe. Never freebase, too messy for the purpose. And then I like to gallop along the tree-lined streets thinking of meaningful emotions. At last, at dusk, I retire each day to my farmhouse, which is erected entirely of dairy products. And what I like to do here is to drive wet nurses wild with my wax doll mustache, and then milk them for whatever I can get from their udders. And in the summer months, I hibernate. If I see a cloud, I follow it. And when it rains, the words, they just drip down from the ceiling, stick to the mud, to the walls, and flow profusely from my fingertips. They penetrate the earth, scatter through the air, and reach for the sky. Marble and horses have veins like mine. But aside from all this, I'm basically ordinary. And like many of you, my greatest ambition in life is to leave pretty much nothing at all behind me. Not so much as a hairpin or a toothpick, or God forbid some lousy appearance in some minor literary anthology. Certainly no icon, no artifact, no memento mori at all that might be used with my name to mangle my memory. I think I mangled that word. And I read just last week in the Harlem Shake of all places that a new exhibition opened up at the Smithsonian that was called Objects of Devotion, Icons, Images, and Other Seemingly Harmless Things That Kill People, or something like that. Anyway. It seems it's true that there was a time in history when a group of people, they called themselves iconoclasts, who believed that images carried the potential to do harm, and that if you stare too long at a work of art, you would become enthralled and fall into a life of sin and idolatry. I admit I've often fantasized about a language that could bring about similar effects as this. But as it is, the only example I can find today for this kind of thing are the so-called slam poets, right here, who live and die by their craft, honest to God, in the streets. And if you yourself have never had the pleasure of witnessing spectacles such as theirs, this is what I'd advise you to do. Take this very poem when you wake up tomorrow morning to your nearest cafe and swallow it whole. Before long, you will begin to choke either on these words or on these scraps of paper, whichever are stronger by then. And if you do not choke, well, you should pretend to choke, at least until a small crowd gathers around to help you, a sizable one hopes, at which point you should promptly shoo them away. Unless, of course, there is a beautiful girl present who is just your type, blonde, not brunette, with plenty of whiskers. And if there is no such girl present, well, you should go on choking, or feigning choking, until you find one. This part of the process can take years, sometimes decades even. But do not despair. Once you do find her, simply point to these words, to these scraps of paper now yellowing mercifully in your rusty esophagus. Point anxiously as if you had swallowed them only yesterday, at least until she helps pull them out of you, one by one, with her bare hands if necessary. And what comes next is easy. She will fall in love with you. And when she asks, years later, inevitably she will ask, why did you do all this back then? And just for me. Do not lie to her. Look her dead in the eye and tell her that you have simply long dreamt of a language that carried the power to do harm. One that might kill someone, even. It's just that this was the first time that it worked. And when she dies, right there on the spot, quite likely, do not despair, at least not for too long. You can still visit this poem at the Smithsonian, where it will be encased in a humidity-controlled vitrine behind bulletproof glass for its own protection, of course, but also for your own. Thank you.